Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Morning, Matt.
Morning, Stu.
Thrive Deeper.
Still in the middle of Leviticus.
We're in the thicket still.
We wish that it would never end, don't we? We want more weird and wonderful ceremonial purity laws, and come on, bring it on.
But having said that, tongue in cheek, I'm learning a lot about this, and a lot of it's about zooming back a little bit out of the detail and actually seeing the big picture of it. And welcome, listeners, and great to have you with us. Leviticus chapter 18.
You're such a nice guy, Stu.
I know. Leviticus 18 to 27, listeners, is where we're going today. And one of the things I notice here, and this is really what's commonly called the Holiness Code.
Yeah.
But what I notice here is there's a striking difference between who is being addressed in this section. So up until now, in the earlier chapters of Leviticus, holiness is largely sort of consecrated in a sacred space, the tabernacle, and then sacred people, the priests. But in these chapters, as we move forward now, we see holiness being democratized.
Yeah.
All of Israel is now called to holiness, and even the land.
Yeah.
You know, the impact of being morally and spiritually not responsive to God's commands actually impacts the land as well. So we see a bit of a shift here where it's now not just the sacred space and the priests, but it's actually the people and the land.
Yeah, that's right. When you get to chapter 18, that is the shift, is that this is about all of the people now. And look, everything, just a general comment, Stu, everything that we've seen so far, I mean, we can joke about the weird and wonderful and slightly laborious nature of the text. Well done if you've made it this far. I mean, I hope you have, because this is the book that I think more than any, I know this sounds funny given the complexity of it, and perhaps it's not as enjoyable a read as other books, but this is the book that I think can really slingshot us into the biblical worldview, into that multidimensional worldview that is so alien to our culture, but it lies behind everything else in Scripture, that sacred, profane dimension.
Totally.
You know, as we've said, a lot of this is about sensitizing the people. A lot of the purity laws is about sensitizing the people to these elements of the sacred and how, therefore, what that therefore means. And so as we move into chapter 18, you get the same idea, but the context is important because the why is very important. And there's two elements to the why. And the first element is that you have been redeemed.
Yes.
You know what I mean? This is everything now is a response. By keeping these laws, you don't win the favor of God. No, because you have been called out of something. You have been redeemed. You've been purchased by the blood, ultimately the blood of Christ. But that's depicted so graphically in the sacrifices. And you are called into this realm of the holy. You have been sanctified, set apart as sacred. And of course, the priests embody that in an important symbolic way. The tabernacle is a picture of that. But of course, the ultimate tabernacle, Stu, is people. Yeah. I mean, the tabernacle is always a symbol of what God wanted his people to be. And so we probably shouldn't be surprised that the first set of laws that we come across are laws around sexual relationships. Our sexuality is like the inner sanctum of our sacred selves, and it's a core part of the human reflection of the divine image. You know, the two, in the way that the man and the woman in their diversity form a unity and therefore reflect something important about the interpersonality of God. And supremely, of course, in the consummation of that relationship through the sexual union. And so that becomes something enormously sacred and something to be protected. I mean, it's interesting that in Genesis chapter 3, the first thing that happens when Adam and Eve sin against God is the covering of the nakedness. And, you know, there's a sense in which they feel the shame there, you know, because they have taken themselves, these consecrated beings, and they've desecrated what has been consecrated through that act of disobedience, and they feel the desecration in their sexuality and the covering of that. Therefore, now it's interesting that the way that sexual relationships are described. I mean, you know, I've got the NIV here, Stu, and if you're reading the NIV, for example, verse 6, it says, "No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations." But the Hebrew terminology underneath that, and the ESV picks that up, and I'm not sure what your version does. Literally, it says, do not uncover the nakedness of.
My translation, same thing, but it also says that the Hebrew word there is the same word that's often used for shame.
Yeah.
So nakedness and shame kind of go together, which then you go back to, as you say, chapter 3 in Genesis, where they hid themselves in the shame and the nakedness together. So interesting,
So because of the fall, the sacred needs to be sectioned off. I mean, of course, there's a sense in which, of course, there's a hierarchy of value still in the original creation. But in this world, in this fallen world, that which is sacred needs to be, even more important sense, set apart. I mean, of course, human beings are set apart from natural creation in one sense at the beginning, but now there's even more reason, because, the world is not just profane, it's become corrupt, and the practices of human beings become corrupt. And so there's an extra sense of being set apart. So the covering of nakedness, in a sense, is a sort of protection around what is sacred. It's not that it's bad. It's just, to cover something in the same way as the Holy of Holies is sectioned off. It's curtained off, right? Because of the state of the world. Whereas originally there's a sense in which the whole world is God's temple in a sense. So this is the sense of uncovering the nakedness. It's like not treating sacred space with respect, And I think that as a general comment about chapter 18, and we're not going to go into all of those laws, we're going to actually attempt today to get to the end of the book of Leviticus and to actually look at this in chunks. And I think this is actually the best way to understand it anyway.
So just one thing before we move out of that, because one thing that really stood out to me, and you've said this in previous chapters, in previous episodes as we've looked at the earlier chapters, that holiness means an ordered life in alignment with God's design. So disorder, especially in the most intimate of human relationships, essentially undermines the stability of the community and its relationship with God. So through all of this, it's kind of like saying, no, this is not the way God created it. We need to stick to God's order, not our disorder, or we risk our community and in fact even the land, is defiled itself. So
that's right. So the idea of uncovering the nakedness, I think it's a really good way to understand what the problem is with messing with sexuality in ways that it's not meant to be treated. Yeah. In any young adult situation, there's always the question of how far is too far, in dating relationships. And I think the terminology of uncovering the nakedness is actually a pretty good answer to that. It's there's a sacred line there, and beyond that, that belongs within the covenant between a man and a woman, a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. And that's God's order. And so anything that, in a sense, messes with that order of things, that lifelong relationship, the two becoming one, is a desecration of what is sacred. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about the list that we have here, the reason for the list is given actually in verse 3. Yeah. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in Canaan. Because you think some of these things you read, wow, there's all of these different things we perhaps wouldn't have even thought of. But these were quite common practices. Yeah, these were quite common practices, and there are lines of order that God has put in place that are not to be transgressed. So certain kinds of relationships that are just not within God's order. They are actually, to us, they seem almost second nature. This is the thing.
But they're only second nature because of this.
Because of this, exactly. So, sleeping with your aunt or sleeping, it's just all these different sorts of relationships, things we think, oh my goodness, no, like these, and there's a big emphasis here on incestuous relationships. That's actually quite common. Brother and sister marriage in Egypt is famously it happened constantly, right? Yeah. And so remember, they've come out of Egypt. They've come out of a situation where sibling marriages actually were quite common, let alone other forms of family marriage. And this is saying, no, this is not the way it's meant to be. And yes, we think the way that we do. If ancient Egypt lived on, it was the greatest for a long time in the ancient world. It was the greatest
influence on civilization.
Influence on civilization. If that carried through, we would be thinking completely differently about sexual relationships. Yeah. It's easy to take this for granted, but we've got to remember why we think the way that we think is because of this. So as we move into chapter 19, that we have lists of various laws. There's not necessarily any order to these, but the big picture here is that this is applying the rules of purity in a sense.
Ritual commands.
Holiness, this is
alongside
about
sort of ethical ones.
That's right. And so there's not, in a sense, it doesn't want to drive too much of a wedge in between those. In a sense, there's an inherent uncleanliness in our natural condition. And we're made pure. So we've discovered how we're purified and how you can remain in that position of purity. But now, because you are sanctified in that way, therefore live accordingly.
Yes.
And so, all of these laws are given as examples, and they're not exhaustive. They're given as examples on how to be holy. And so right at the start, chapter 19, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy." And that's the repeated thing throughout this. Even as we move into chapter 20.
And that's because God was going to live with them. It's not like you went to where God was. Now his presence with the people.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, he was a witness to everything they were doing.
That's right. You are joined to me, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And therefore, because you're joined to me, you are in sacred space. You are sacred space now, right? So now you need to be holy as I am holy. That's the idea.
Do not take the Lord's name in vain.
Exactly.
Represent me well.
Which is bearing, that commandment is bearing the name of God in a way that is discordant with who God is, essentially. That's what that commandment is. So,
we've got honouring parents, we've got honest business practices, we've got care for the poor, we've got love for the neighbour, and of course the famous command that Jesus then quotes, of course, as part of the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, you shall love your neighbour as yourself.
That's right. That's here in Leviticus 19.
In Leviticus,
Interestingly, Stu, here, verse 19 of chapter 19, do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. So it's mixing things, putting things together that should not be put together. Now, I'm wearing material that's woven of two different kinds. But the point here is this is, I guess, a physical way of them embodying this principle, right? This is similar to the purity laws in order to ingrain this sense that the two should not be mixed, right? The sacred can't be mixed with the profane. These laws essentially function to ingrain that. They're constant reminders of that.
But also, I think, I was thinking to myself about exactly that and thinking, imagine if I had to get up every morning and think about what I was putting on in the context of God's rule around that. It would constantly keep my focus on the fact that God is with us.
Yeah.
Whereas
absolutely.
It's easy for us to forget. So I think that chapter, if we want to keep moving here, really speaks to the fact that you cannot be holy towards God if you're being unjust towards people. Those two things come together. Being holy just toward God and treating other people poorly is not going to make it.
Yeah, that's right. And some amazing laws protecting the poor. I mean, do not harvest right to the edge of the fields. Leave the stuff that falls to the ground. Leave that for the poor and the alien, and so forth. So, and that's quite unique to this set of laws. Remember, we've seen a lot of these laws already in Exodus, and one of the things that I said about those laws, if you put them together, and you do need to put them together to sort of understand, and this is something we won't go into a lot today, but essentially what these laws were doing was disrupting what would otherwise have been a class caste system.
Yes.
Caste systems were the rule in ancient society. There was no sense of natural inequality. When you put these laws together, essentially what they are doing is disrupting caste systems in different ways. So, it can be slightly alarming when there are laws around slaves, and it sounds to our ears, seems to be accommodating. They didn't have slavery. It wasn't like
we think
19th century American African American slavery.
No.
It was a sort of debt labor. They were servants, and they
owed money, and how they paid it back
paying off
was
debt.
work.
Yeah, that's right. So also, when you put the laws of slavery together, you've essentially got the abolition of slavery.
Yes.
Essentially. Yeah. So it's important to remember that.
And that whole caste system thing, I think we'll see a little later on as well, in terms of making sure that the wealthy just don't keep getting wealthy and the wealthier, and the poor keep getting poor. We'll get to that. But, there's some provisions in there that reset everything, which we'll come to in time.
And, interesting laws for the foreigners as well.
Yes.
This is really interesting because that preempts where this is all going.
Yes.
Because, there are these promises in the prophets about, the nations coming to your light. You're to be a light to the nations. I mean, we think of that as, Christians, you are the light, Jesus saying you are the light of the world. But that was originally said to the nation of Israel, right? You are a light for the Gentiles, and this idea that the nations are going to come to you. And we see these moments like with the Queen of Sheba and so forth. But these laws covering the stranger and the alien, like the foreigner coming and treating the foreigner well, them having a good experience, because even with people who are mistreated in other nations. I mean, slaves even, would have come to them because whereas every other culture made it mandatory to send an escaped slave home, it's the opposite in the Mosaic law. You must not send an escaped slave back to its master. I mean, that's quite remarkable.
And more the point, you should take them in as a member of your family.
That's
beyond that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And if you mistreat them, they get to go free.
Yeah.
So again, you put these laws together and you really have something quite remarkable. I mean, whereas most nations are very tribal and it's, like accommodating the strangers,
unlikely,
it's not really a concern. Whereas here, this is looking beyond this to something. So just remember when we're looking at laws, and this is important for chapter 20 as we go into this as well. Remember, this is a step along the way. We're in a story here, and the story is unfolding, and this plan of redemption is progressive, right? This is a step in a better direction. And so it's not the perfection. The perfection is found in Jesus. The perfect expression of God's will is found in Jesus. This is a step forwards, right? Yeah. And also we've got to remember this is a nation. So keeping order, this is where you get to what I'm going to describe as the necessary evil of punishments.
Yes. And
this is what's outlined in chapter 20, the punishments for different transgressions.
The sort of communal accountability.
That's right. We've got to remember, this is a civil law as well. This is keeping order amongst people of hundreds of thousands of people. So, and this is looking forward also to them being in the land. And so you need a law that has the dissuasive elements and, that has the punishments there. Now, of course, in our society, they seem harsh, but by ancient standards, it's what they don't do actually that's remarkable, in these laws, Stu, because, if you look at ancient Egypt and particularly ancient Assyria and Babylon, I mean, honestly, it's horrific. Yeah, it's horrific, the things like prolonged forms of punishment. And you just don't get that. It's enough to have
deterrent
effect. But it's actually compared to the nations around, it's limited. Even there are some provisions for floggings, but where that is, it's limited and an official has to be present to make sure it does not go over. Yeah. It's not here in this chapter. But by the way, and again, this is not here, but I'll just mention this now. There are places where it mentions that such and such is to be burned. And what that means is the corpse is to be burned.
Yes,
right?
not burned alive.
Yeah, not. This has been famously misunderstood because, part of like the sorcerer or if a priest's daughter or son or whatever, there's a sense of double with that. Like it's not saying tie them to a stake and burn them to death like, what we think. No, it's because burial was a big part of what you do with the body and it was important in the ancient world. So for the corpse to be burned says something about the level of uncleanness that they've descended into. Yeah. So it the burning the corpse had a particular symbolic. So anyway, my point is if you see that, we can too easily see these things through
our current Western
lens.
kind of lies without realizing this is a completely different world. Yeah. So we see in chapter 20 really, the communal accountability comes in that sin's not really just a personal thing. It threatens the entire covenant community. And hence the severe penalties really underscore how seriously holiness is to be taken when it comes to.
And it's interesting.
But it's not, as you said, about moral perfectionism. It's actually about covenant faithfulness. It's actually about let's be faithful to a God who has redeemed us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't have punishments that with a level of severity, it says that this doesn't matter to an ancient people.
That's right. That's not that
That's what it says.
Yeah,
so you've got to remember this is a conversation with an ancient people in an ancient context. And it's interesting to note what's different as well, because in other laws, like ancient Hittite laws and the Babylonian law of Hammurabi, for example, it's the economic considerations are first and foremost, whereas the laws concerning people and who the people are seem to come to the fore here. So, for example, in Israel, religious offences and offences against life and the structure of the family, they are treated more severely than they are actually in the rest of the ancient world, because it wasn't so much an economic problem in these other cultures, whereas this is actually saying sins against God, against your family, and against other people generally,
because
are
they're sacred.
more serious because of the sacredness of those relationships. And so there is some differences there that I think say important things. So it says in chapter 20, verse 22, keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I'm bringing you to live may not vomit you out. And that is the language of uncleanness. This sense that I'm setting this land apart as holy. The land is, in a sense, is going to be a kind of new Eden. So the land is becoming a new sort of holy place. And if you transgress my laws, you become unclean and the land's going to vomit you out. So he says in verse 23, you must not live according to the customs of the nations I'm going to drive out before you, right? So there's a sense that the land is vomiting them out. And if you live like them, the same thing is going to happen. Same thing is going to happen to you. So again, right at the end, in fact, in the middle, verse 7, consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. So I have set you apart. So consecrate yourselves. God has set us apart, but we need to live accordingly, essentially. And then at the end, you've got again, verse 26, you are to be holy to me because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So that's the repeated statement right through there. Now, there are levels of seriousness, and we get to laws for the priests. And of course, the priests...
This is chapter 21, 22 we're moving into now.
Yeah, there's an extra level of strictness and rigor for the priests because of who they are.
And not because they're morally superior.
No.
But because they represent God to the people and people to God.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So there's just extra things that are open to other people that for them because of who they are. And the thing to remember here, because some of these things seem harsh, like if you're crippled or if you have some bodily deformity, you can't serve in the temple. We think, that just seems mean, right?
Yes.
But no, we've got to remember that they are symbolic individuals in their role. Okay,
Yes.
They are symbolic individuals. It's not that they're barred from God, having a relationship with God, or that God doesn't love them. They have to stand for, ultimately they're standing for the priestly ministry of Christ. They're standing for wholeness, in a sense. They are standing for holiness. And so in the same ways as the sacrifices that had to be brought had to be without defect. So the priests, because anything to come within the temple precinct, which was a sort of, a new Eden, it was the place of holiness and perfection. And so, what was to be offered and those who were offering it had to be accordingly without defect.
The closer the proximity to the holy, then the greater the care had to be taken as well.
That's right. And it's because of what they are symbolically.
Yeah.
Okay,
so and holiness is not about privilege, but it's about, as we said in the last episode, it's about responsibility.
Yeah.
Leadership in God's community is always held to high account because of who God is.
Yeah. So all of the people are holy, but there's a sense in which the priests are holy. They've got that extra kind of weight upon them of responsibility. So from that, we are reminded of the fact that the sacrifices also need to be without defect. So in the same way as the priests need to be without defect in all sorts of different ways, including who they can marry and what the past of the people they can marry. It's quite stringent, again, for symbolic purposes. And then we have these rules around sacrifices because, again, the sacrifice is ultimately symbolic of the perfect being given for the imperfect, right? Perfect in the place of the imperfect.
So it's, as you say, three-dimensional theology here.
Yeah,
exactly.
So right at the end of chapter 22, keep my commands and follow them. I am the Lord. Verse 32, do not profane my holy name. If you don't do these things, you're saying things about me that are not true, right?
Yes.
You're misrepresenting me. So do not profane my holy name, for I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. I am the Lord who made you holy and who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. So the rules regarding the priests reflect directly on God. And that's why this is so important, because of the way that their role, the way that they carry the name of God in that special sense. I think it's also worth us remembering that we are called a kingdom of priests. There is a kind of extra for us as well, not in the symbolic sense because there's a symbolism that is unique to the temple, but you certainly get this sense in the New Testament that there is a greater form of righteousness that is required of us because we are this kingdom of priests. The New Testament doesn't get more lax in terms of the responsibility and the expectations. It's actually increased. It's dialed up.
Well, because now we're the temple.
That's right. We are the temple. And so that call to holiness upon the priests is essentially democratized to everyone. So, yeah.
We move into chapter 23 and it, here's probably some of the most controversial that probably would have really been considered strange to the nations surrounding Israel, because now holiness comes into time and provision.
That's right.
And that would have confounded the nations, particularly some of these things when we get into the Jubilee and all those sorts of things. It's like, that's going to confound the nations around them.
For sure.
And again, this is so that they can be a light.
And these are laws that are going to upend, really upend the caste system. But anyway, life was to be punctuated around worship. You already get this in Genesis chapter 1. The first chapter, the middle point is the sacred seasons, the moon and the sun marking sacred seasons for worship, right? That's right at the center point of this incredibly intricately theological narrative in Genesis chapter 1. And so worship is at the center. The idea is life is oriented around worship. And so you get these sacred seasons, these 5 festivals that are described here that bring the people back to God, to remembering who they are and what God has done for them and who God is and what he does. Their time is to be punctuated by this. First of all, time is already punctuated by the Sabbath. So we start there.
Yes.
So the climax of the week is rest. It's life-oriented around rest and worship and the recognition of the goodness of God. Already the Sabbath, and it was interesting reading some of the literature on the Sabbath and how countercultural this was. Massively countercultural.
It's not just the people, the land, everything, all of creation.
And
rest.
Absolutely unique. This had never been heard of, right?
Yeah.
So, life was just perpetual labor. This is creating this, punctuating life with this moment of stop and remember God. This is so unique to the biblical context. So the Sabbath is a weekly thing, but the year was punctuated by these 5 festivals, and eventually it will become 7 when you add Hanukkah and Purim to them. Hanukkah is the celebration of the rededication of the temple under the Maccabees. Purim goes back to the story of Esther. But that obviously hasn't happened yet. So you're going to get those 2 festivals that are added. But what you've got here, you've got 5 festivals. So you've got the Passover, and I should say the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's obviously celebrating the exodus from Egypt, and unleavened bread being a symbol of haste. We're temporary residents here, and we're on our way to something better. And so, that festival celebrates, of course, for them what constituted them as a people, Stu. It was them being set apart. When judgment came across, you still, you were no different except for the blood over the doors. And so this reminder of who they are, but that they are that by grace, so that was commemorated yearly. Then you've got the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. So this is in spring. These are spring festivals, and that's at the end of the wheat harvest. And it's essentially an acknowledgement of God's provision. It's stopping and recognizing God's bounty. I think significant that it's at the festival, during the festival of Pentecost, that the Holy Spirit comes, because the ultimate provision of God, of course, is the provision of himself, God in us, the Holy Spirit.
And then it's also important. Our harvesting responsibility, to be the ones who God sends.
That's right. As workers in the harvest. That's right. Then you've got the Feast of Trumpets is the third of these. The trumpet blast on the first day of the 7th month. This is an autumn feast.
And that was to celebrate the beginning of the civil year, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And a dedication of that to God. You've got the Day of Atonement. We've talked about that in the last episode. And
so that's a 1 day a year where the priest would go in and atone for the sins of the people once a year. We talked about that, as you say, in the last year.
And this gives instructions for the people, actually. Yes. This is to be a time of fasting and, very solemn sort of moment. And then you've got the Feast of Booths, which is them celebrating their time, the time that they're still in. At this stage.
Wandering in the
desert. So, it's interesting because they're still in this, right? Yeah. And he's saying, when you go into the land, you need to have a celebration that reminds you of now. It's really interesting to think that that's being told to them now. And they've still got 40 years of living in temporary shelters in the desert.
Because this is relatively early on. This is at Mount Sinai where they've just got out of Egypt.
At the beginning of that journey, right.
Because at this point in time, they didn't know it was going to be 40 years.
Yeah.
God probably knew, but they didn't know.
That's right. And so you're going to remember for thousands of years to come, you're going to remember living, in these temporary shelters and remember the time in the desert. So that's those festivals.
So these festivals which really speak to God's redemptive acts for the people of Israel up until this point in time really reminds Israel that their identity is not shaped about their productivity, as you talked about before. It was all about economics, but actually about remembrance and worship. That was what their lives were to be centered around.
That's right. And that makes them different. And that makes them, this is what makes them a light to the nations. And it's interesting when you go into chapter 24, this idea that the lamps are to be kept continually burning kind of connects with this. It's a symbolism that reminds them that they need to continually be lamps to the world. And also, it's a symbol of God's presence being continually with them, that they are a light to the world because the presence of God is to be continually with them. And also the lamps burning continually remind them of the continuation, the perpetual nature of God's promises. So it says this is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, right? You're going to keep the lamps burning in the tabernacle.
And remembering light, that was the only way they had light was through lamps or fire or whatever. And interestingly, and I'm not sure if there's much of a connection here, but Genesis, it was the first thing God created.
Yeah, that's right.
The very first thing was let there be light.
Yeah. And then the continual provision of bread, that the table of bread is to be continually stocked. And this idea is that, again, God is the continual provider. It's the perpetual nature of God's faithfulness. There's an interesting moment here at the end of chapter 24 here, Stu, where we have an instance where someone blasphemes the name of God with a curse. I mean, why you would do this is a little baffling, but this is quite a severe thing. It's not just uttering the holy name of Yahweh, but actually he cursed the name of God. And so this becomes a moment where they, in a sense, purge this offense from their midst, purge this person from their midst. So as harsh as this is, it's an instance demonstrating this is what these laws are for, right? We can't have this kind of thing in our midst because this is going to spread. This sort of attitude is going to spread. I mean, we don't know why this takes place, but it becomes a moment where they're reminded this is really serious and you need to treat it as serious. It's not just words. You're a holy people, and what you speak now is very, very important because you are the mouthpiece to the world. And so
I wondered whether there was some significance because it's very clear that the one who blasphemed was the son of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian father. And I wondered whether there was a point of saying foreigners are welcome. I know it was an Israelite mother, but if you're going to be part of our community, then you honour what's important to us, what's holy to us.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that in that case, the community, like those who heard him, they laid their hands upon there's almost a sense of the sin of one can't be separated from everyone. Like there's we tend to separate people out as though, it's nothing to do with me. But there is a sense when the one sins, it affects the all. It brings everyone down in a sense. And so perhaps there's something of that there. So that leads to a reminder that to be a level of strictness here, it was always a matter of discretion on the part of the judges. Those penalties were available, but I guess this is saying be sure, ensure that you carry these things through so that they're effective, so that effectively this community retains its level of holiness, because this is so countercultural for them. A lot of these practices are things that they're not used to, right? They're used to throwing the names of gods around, or I don't know what, they're used to crossing these lines constantly or treating others in certain exploitative ways. And so this is saying you're really going to need to be strict because this needs to be ingrained, right? This is in the infancy of this nation. You're going to have pretty strict lines, and people need to know when they cross them. So particularly important for this stage. Then we get to this, again, hugely, this is so revolutionary. First of all, the Sabbath year, which is the 7th year, the land is to be rested.
Yes.
The land gets a rest.
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons for, but we know now, I'm not going to go into this because I'm not an expert in this, but we now know this is actually really good for the land. The land actually needs this. And so this is actually the better for their farming. But it's an expression of faith as well, okay, because we're going to let the land rest because the land is holy. And giving the land a rest is a bit of an expression of the fact that the land is also being set apart, and that God will cause the land still to provide enough for, it essentially has to be 3 years, because if they leave the land, it's going to take another couple of years for the land harvest. To yield. Yeah. So basically, they have to really rely on God that the harvests in that 6 years are going to be bounteous enough for them to have enough to cover the gap. The land is still going to produce something. And interesting there, the provision for the wild animals.
Yeah, yeah.
Leave the land, let it go, leave it to the wild animals. So this ensured that there was always a space where wild animals could graze. How's that frickin' sound?
Yeah.
I mean, just remarkable.
But this is pretty amazing, radical really in terms of the nations, the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. The land must rest, debts are released, and slaves are set free.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, everyone else be going, what? Why?
Yeah, exactly.
And again, the reality I think here at that point God's trying to make is the land doesn't belong to Israel, it belongs to God.
Yeah,
it belongs to me. And human ownership is always provisional. Yeah. And it kind of resists this culture of accumulation and exploitation and for others despair and the rest of it. It kind of balances everything out again.
Yeah, I mean the whole
God's generosity and justice is
piece of land, the arc that goes over where the Euphrates is, and the essentially ancient Mesopotamia. It's interesting when you look at it on a map that has the colouring of where the fertile lands are. It's complete desert. I mean, I've flown over it. And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that it was actually rich at one point, quite rich farming land. It was essentially farmed to death. It was essentially destroyed through constant farming. And so essentially this is kind of preventing that. It effectively prevents that sort of thing as well. Yeah. Speak about revolutionary. The year of Jubilee is up there. And as I said before, Stu, this is really going to prevent a caste system because essentially after 49 years, all property is redistributed. Now, the core source of wealth in an agrarian society is land, right? Yeah. The land is what produces the wealth. Now, in that culture, as in any culture, what tends to happen is that, people go into debt, they sell off land, and so you've got a few people owning a lot of the resource, right? And that was what you had in all the other areas in the ancient Near East. This is to prevent that from happening, right? So this is to prevent all of the resources passing into the hands of few people, which essentially is what creates a sort of caste system. With the poor and the slaves, you're going to have slavery is going to come from that because of the debt and so forth that people are going to fall into. And so this is actually a core preventative of, that kind of hierarchy or that kind of polarized situation from emerging. So basically after 49 years, the land goes back to the original share. Now we've got to remember, they're not in the land yet. They're a long way from being in the land, but this is beforehand being set in place that all property gets redistributed back to the original share. I mean, it's a revolutionary idea.
Well, essentially, if you read it, and I could be reading it wrong, it feels more like you never really own the land.
That's right.
What you own is the right to produce crop on the land.
Yeah.
And, if you sell the land, all you're really doing is selling the right to produce crops up until year 49.
Yeah, you're selling a lease, essentially.
Yeah. And then it talks about if it's a walled property, so essentially if it's a house which therefore doesn't produce any crops, well, there's a slightly different structure for how that's to work.
Yeah.
But absolutely revolutionary. So, you prevented the accumulation of those who had and those who did not have,
Yeah, that's right. So verse 23, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine.
Yeah.
And you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. So just remember that doesn't belong to you. Yeah. And so this redistribution of the land continually reminds them of that. Now, was this practiced? I mean, this is the interesting question. And on the whole, probably not. At least we can't see any particular period where this was rigorously practiced. probably the first time you get a real indication that something like this was practiced, this idea of a shared property. It's actually in the early church, Acts chapter 2. And this is interesting, right at the end of Acts chapter 2, as a result of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, what Luke wants to show essentially is that this principle of shared ownership was actually first practiced by the church as a result of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. But look, the principle is there, and maybe to some extent it was. I mean, it's hard to say, but we just don't. No. We don't really know. I think scholars have some doubts about whether it was really practiced. So we finish the book of Leviticus in much the same way that the book of Deuteronomy finishes, which is blessings and curses, rewards for obedience, punishment for disobedience. Remember, this is in the infancy of a people. And so as with, children when they're growing up and they need to know where boundaries, they need to feel boundaries before that's internalized. They recognize that obedience is its own reward. God's going to follow these things with very physical consequences, right? So if you are faithful and you obey my commandments, you'll be blessed, right? I'll look after you. But if you don't, if you stray away, then judgment is going to come. So it's interesting in the section where he talks about the punishments for disobedience. He talks about verse 17, chapter 26. I will set my face against you. You'll be defeated by your enemies, and those you'll be oppressed, and all of this. But verse 18, if after all this you will not listen to me, I will punish you. So the implication there is at any point you have the option to turn around and repent and turn back to me, right? And then look, verse 21. If you remain hostile toward me and refuse to listen to me, I will, and then it, continues. Then verse 23, if in spite of all these things you do not accept my correction, but continue to be hostile toward me, then I will, and it continues, right? So you've got these repeated statements there throughout this.
There's always an opportunity to turn back.
There's always this implied opportunity, right? So this will keep going, of course, unless you turn around. That's the implication behind that repeated comment. And then verse 40, but if they confess their sins, interestingly, listen to this, Stu, if they confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, this is so important, right? That we're part of something big. We're never in isolation. So the standard form of confession in the Bible is, Lord, forgive us, for we have sinned even as our fathers did, even as our ancestors did. If they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, because inevitably we tend to continue in the patterns of those ancestors. So that's part of recognizing the problem and what we're part of, what we're complicit in. Their unfaithfulness and their hostility toward me. Verse 42, I will remember my covenant and I will remember the land, right? This is God's promise behind all of this. When these things unfold, at any point, if you turn back to me, I will respond. I will respond to you.
But turning back does mean making the sacrifices for your sin and paying the consequences of that. It's not like, cool, start again. It's like, no, there's still the process of going through to be purified, as we've talked about. So the offerings need to be made, all those sorts of things, which really shows the genuineness of the decision to turn.
The way that the book of Leviticus ends, Stu, is strange, and in the commentaries, there's no real suggestion for why chapter 27 is placed where it is. And it possibly because there was no other place for this, but it feels like a little bit of a reminder. But let me just summarize what this is about, because very common in an ancient context is this idea of making a vow to a god. If you do that, it's, again, you're in quite a transactional world, remember, and they're going to still naturally think quite transactionally, right? Yep. And so, they're in the habit of, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, sort of. Now, this is not it's not really the kind of relationship that God wants. However, because how you use the name of God and taking responsibility for the promises that you make is actually really important, because you're reflecting a God who keeps his promises, right? So the idea here is if you make a vow, you need to keep your vow. So one of the vows that they would make would be to dedicate a person.
Yeah.
It could be one of your own, should dedicate. And basically the provision that's made here is that you can redeem them back, right? I get that you're going to make these. You have to keep your promises, but here's a way that this can be redeemed within limits. There are some things that you can't. So for example, if you vow an animal, right, that animal's, it's mine. You got to keep your vow. If you dedicate your house, that's mine. So this is saying, if you do that, just be really careful because I'm going to hold you to that.
Yes.
So don't do that lightly, okay?
Yeah.
And perhaps there were other ways in which they could maybe find little loopholes. And even in Jesus' time, the Pharisees had all sorts of loopholes where you could sort of get out of your vows. And essentially, Jesus' response to all of this, and it's a complicated, chapter that probably, relates more to things that happen, at that time. But Jesus' response to this is essentially, he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
That's right.
That's where he puts. Don't be vowing. Don't make those. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. At the end of this, we're reminded, though, in verse 30, just remember, a tithe of everything from the land belongs to me, right? That's up front. That already belongs to me, right?
Not negotiable.
So that's one of these not negotiables, right? It actually already belongs to me. And if you don't give that 10% over to me, God says, then you're essentially, as Malachi points out, you're essentially robbing me. That for them was an important recognition. It was a gesture of worship, but also a gesture of trust in God. And that's where we finish the book of Leviticus, Stu. Again, quite a slog, and well done if you've made it through this far. In the next episode, we move back into more narrative, and there's some great stuff there in the book of Numbers, some very famous stories.
I was trying to find a way of unpacking in a summary sentence really what reading this in a new light and looking at it from a higher view has kind of done. And I think these chapters through Leviticus sort of prepare us to understand why holiness is ultimately fulfilled not through law keeping, but through God dwelling with his people.
Yeah.
He's with his people and transforming them from the inside out, working with them, understanding who he is and his holiness. And of course, that points forward to the work of Christ, which we will see in the coming time.
That's right. And that is the center point. And I think this is a good place to finish right through the book of Leviticus. I mean, the book of Leviticus is the center of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of Moses. At the center of the book of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement. In the middle of all of this, and we've read a lot of laws and there's a lot of detail here, but right at the center of it is this moment where we are reminded that it is God who provides for us. He provides grace and forgiveness and reconciliation with us. This isn't about what we do for God. Everything that is here is a continual reminder of what God has done for us ultimately in Jesus Christ.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.